so welcome everybody. This is our August Zoom at noon. It's just 2 minutes after noon Eastern time. I'm Alex, a co-host with Charlie Froman. And I know this is a topic that Charlie is extremely dedicated to and passionate about. So I'm gonna let him introduce our speakers and get this going.
Real quick, Odette, if you want to mention real quick the court case on the FCC. As folks know, NHF has another campaign to force Congress to make the wireless industry show its radiation and power emissions from their wireless base stations and towers, and to require mitigation when those maximum power limits are exceeded, which I think will slow down 5G, because we find that 5G telecom companies do have to use high power for the 5G to work. It's a very dense mesh system where they have to locate the towers closer to your house, closer to your bedroom, your classroom. Odette, can you give a real brief implication of that court case?
Yes, I'd be happy to do so. The FCC had not really quite opened up the docket, but was considering whether to revisit their exposure limits. These are exposure limits for how much the population can be exposed to RF radiation. That's radio frequency radiation, whether it's 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, or whatever. And this was open for a long time, for many years. And then I believe it was a couple of years ago that the FCC closed the discussion and said, we don't have to revisit our exposure limits. Now, if you can just imagine, their exposure limits were set in 1996. It is now 2021. If you were flying a plane and you knew that their safety standards had not been updated since 1996, I don't think you'd want to fly on that plane. Or car safety standards. So it's been a very long time, and since then the technology has changed substantially. So if you can just imagine back in 1996 what your computer looked like and what your computer looks like now, it's a very different technology. The same thing with these exposure limits. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals, which is just underneath the Supreme Court, determined that the FCC acted in violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. There were thousands of comments of people who had been injured from radiation, including children, including people who died. And the FCC determined that there was no reason to revisit their exposure limits. The DC Circuit Court of Appeals said that the Administrative Procedure Act requires that they use a reasoned approach to determine the exposure limits. And a reasoned approach is to take into consideration the comments that they received, which they did. They failed to do so. And therefore, the FCC acted in an arbitrary and capricious manner. Those are the talismanic words indicating that the court is specifying that the FCC has not done what they were supposed to do. And therefore, they have to go back and revisit their exposure limits. So the exposure limit seems to be, it's totally out of date. So this is a very, very good decision. This case was brought by the Environmental Health Trust and by the Children's Health Defense. So we'll just wait to see what the FCC does, but this is very good news.
Thank you, Odette. So probably the docket will be reopened, and the FCC can't just cavalierly say our 3-decade almost safety guidelines are perfectly fine for technology that didn't exist back then. Meanwhile, we continue to educate congressional staff and members about the lack of monitoring and mitigation as the industry continues to be rogue in its deployment of wireless. towers and the new rule, OTARD rule, which you'll hear about, where folks can just mount a 5G antenna on their house. There's not a darn thing you can do about it. But if there's no true safety backing it, that might slow down the deployments. We'll see about that. But we're going to discuss this obviously in the future, as we do every month. These are the most important issues for mankind.